Hello. I think it's really exciting that in the past couple of years we've been getting new books which self-consciously build upon canonical literature from the past. So there is Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, which is a brilliant reimagining of David Copperfield in contemporary rural America. And there is Sandra Newman's Julia, which is a really clever retelling of 1984 from the point of view of Winston's love interest. And I'm sure there are other examples as well. And this certainly isn't a new phenomenon. So there is Wide Sargasso Sea, which is an excellent example of taking a striking character whose perspective we don't get in the original, in this case, the so-called mad woman in the attic in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and reimagining the world from her point of view. And now we have Percival Everett's new novel, James, which has been much publicized and much talked about, and I think deservedly so. It shows some of the same events from Mark Twain's classic Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and it creates some new ones, but shows them from the point of view of Jim. And it does this by utilizing Everett's customary sense of wit and satire to re-envision this story and this period of history in a way which feels, to me, refreshing and revelatory, because we can really see and understand James's position and the terror he feels as a runaway slave and his desperate struggle to free his family from slavery and his yearning for a sense of freedom outside of the subjugation he's been born into in the antebellum South. Now, first off, the question that a lot of people quite rightly ask is, do you need to read or reread Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn before getting to James? And I don't think it's strictly necessary, although it will help you appreciate Everett's book a lot more. So in my case, I did reread both these books before getting to James, and I'm really glad I did so. I had read abridged versions of these when I was younger, but I really didn't remember many details from them. So if you don't get a chance to read or reread these books, I would at least suggest going to look at an outline of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn before reading James, because it'll really help you understand what Everett is doing in this book. And it was largely enjoyable returning to these stories, although I find it a bit difficult to relate to them or even honestly care about them now, of these boys' sense of adventure and their hijinks. These episodic stories seem designed for the entertainment of young boys, so often the plot feels skewed so that these adolescent characters will triumph in different situations, or there will be different coincidences which lead them to different dramatic situations. This means at the end of Tom Sawyer, these boys have achieved great fortune, and it does feel like Huckleberry Finn is a much stronger novel in a lot of ways. I found it especially vivid and terrifying reading about Huck's abuse at the hands of his father at the beginning of this novel, but throughout a lot of his journey, it does feel like a game that Huck is playing, and all the while, Jim is the honorable, superstitious, and mild-mannered character at his side. It is very touching reading about the growing friendship between them over the course of the story, and it is really impressive how Twain deals with the moral complexity that Huck experiences, having grown up in this period of time and area and culture where people with Jim's skin color are treated as property, but his growing emotional connection with Jim disallows him from seeing him as such. But of course, this is only one side of the story. And of course, it is very jarring reading about the language that's used in this novel. I was lucky enough recently to see Everett being interviewed by the great young author Caleb Azumah Nelson, and I was sat right at the front, so I recorded this interview because I don't think it was otherwise recorded or posted anywhere. And Nelson asked him at one point his inspiration behind writing James. So I'll show you a clip of that.
What gravitated you towards this? Or towards Jim? Well, again, it's hardly a romantic answer. I was playing tennis, and I hit the ball just wildly out of the court. And as I watched the ball sail, I thought, I wonder if anyone has written this story from Jim's point of view. And which also explained to me why I hit the ball so poorly. And I went home and I started looking, and it turned out no one had. And I just decided to do it. I didn't know that. And I thought at the time was, why hasn't anyone done this before? And then I realized I hadn't thought of it either. So I tried to.
Interestingly, Everett may be the first author to have rewritten Twain's novel from Jim's point of view, but he is not the first author to have imagined this idea, because in Paul Beattie's novel, The Sellout, there's an interesting and funny debate where a character named Foy Chester describes how he read Huckleberry Finn to his grandchildren and was shocked to discover that the N-word appears 219 times in that book. So he rewrote Twain's novel from Jim's point of view, and he describes how where the repugnant N-word occurs, I replaced it with warrior and the word slave with dark-skinned volunteer. I also improved Jim's diction, rejiggered the plotline a bit, and retitled the book The Pejorative Free Adventures and Intellectual and Spiritual Journeys of African-American Jim and his young protege, white brother Huckleberry Finn, or They Go in Search of the Lost Black Family Unit. However, the narrator of Beattie's novel then challenges Chester, stating, why blame Mark Twain? Because you don't have the patience and courage to explain to your children that the N-word exists. No one will ever refer to them as little black euphemisms, so welcome to the American lexicon. So the language in Mark Twain's novel has been subject to a long-standing debate, but to change or erase any of these words which were so thoughtlessly, cruelly, and freely used in the past would mean that we don't learn from history. So I think it's really smart and important that Everett has positioned this novel not as a rewrite of Twain's book, but as a chance to tell the story from Jim's side. So James begins by showing a section of the notebook of Dan Emmett and the lyrics he wrote, because he was a real-life composer and he was the founder of the first black minstrel troupe. And this takes on a significance later on in Everett's novel. But I love how this story begins with Tom and Huck playing one of their familiar jokes on James, but it shows how James is very aware of this game that they're playing, and he's indulgently playing along as well. James recognizes throughout the book that adolescent Huck is very attracted to adventure, and so he will sometimes manipulate Huck to take a certain course of action by trying to convince him about what fun it will be. This new characterization immediately negates the idea that James is a naive butt of the joke, which would be easy to assume just from reading Twain's novel. Instead, Everett portrays James as intelligent, literate, and an educator who teaches enslaved black children about the language they must adopt and the manner they must assume around white people in order to avoid punishment, and survive in this world. It's poignant how the importance of language is emphasized throughout the novel. Natural speech occurs between James and other Black people whenever they're conversing, but they quickly revert to a kind of dumbed down language whenever white people overhear them, because they're very aware that they're not only expected to speak like this, but they will be punished for using the same language that white people use. James must continuously check himself and the way he speaks when Huck is around over the course of their adventures, because even though there's a growing camaraderie between them, he must maintain this barrier, and this necessary front grows to feel even more tragic and sad the closer they become. It's also striking that when James drops the affected form of speech around white characters that he's confronting, it's the inability to believe that he could use such language that preoccupies these white characters rather than the immediate threat of violence that they're facing. I was also very moved by the reverence that James has for books and writing, because they're the only true sources of freedom available to him. So we see how attentively he dries books that fall in the river, and how much he values the precious time that he can take reading these books in secret when not being overviewed by white characters. But it's also wonderful how he enters into a dreamlike or hallucinatory dialogue with philosophers of the Enlightenment, like John Locke and Voltaire, where he challenges them on their concepts of freedom versus his lived reality. And this is a brilliant way of interrogating a whole school of influential thought. It's also easy to imagine that if James had been born into a different time, place, and circumstances, he would have been a great scholar, studying philosophy and publishing many important books. But as it is, it's very touching following his intense desire to write and to tell his own story. And we also see how he tests out different surnames over the course of the book. The very ability to obtain a pencil becomes something which is so precious, and it's tragic and harrowing seeing the consequences of when another Black man obtains a pencil for him and the fallout of that. It's interesting how Everett's novel mostly follows the same timeline and events that Twain laid out in his book, but there are interludes when James is separated from Huck, and so Everett, of course, then had the freedom to fill in these periods of time however he wanted to. And also through James' eyes, some of the characters of Twain's book, like the con artists, are much less fun and more threatening, actually quite vicious and terrifying. The events and timeline of this story become much more altered towards the end. And I think I read an interview somewhere, not the one that I saw Everett give with Nelson, but where he said that he thought Twain was indulging the reading public by reintroducing the character of Tom Sawyer at the end of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because he thought that this is what the reading public would want. But this really doesn't serve the story or the characters of Huck or James. So I found it really fascinating and harrowing where Everett takes this story. The whole question of freedom and identity becomes much more layered as James joins a minstrel show and meets a character who's passing for white, and the true relationship between him and Huck is revealed. This gives a whole new meaning to their bond and why James is especially attentive and caring towards Huck. Now, in the past, I've not been that big a fan of satirical writing in general, because often in these books there are exaggerated versions of villainous characters that are presented in a way, quite justifiably usually, to diminish their power. But in general, I feel it's better to present characters in a more nuanced way to show that everyone is really complex. But Everett uses this style to fantastic effect. His novel The Trees used satire in a much more blatant way, where some of the white characters were purposefully portrayed as stereotypes, and to portray them as such partly was Everett's way of challenging us to review the books and the movies we've consumed in the past where black characters were stereotyped in a different way. Probably little exaggeration was necessary when portraying the racist white characters in this story, because their assumed superiority was so much a part of the culture, and even those who claimed to be kind to slaves maintained their dominant position and wielded their power when it suited them. Conversely, the slaves that James engages with in private have cerebral conversations and use heightened language to emphasize the unrealized intellectual potential and psychological complexity of these characters that are often portrayed just as jovial and kind-hearted slaves in Twain's novel and countless other stories. And I think it's really effective and powerful how Everett does this in his novel. Also, in Twain's stories, the boys often surreptitiously view people and scenes while they are concealed, and this adds to the entertainment and drama of it all, as if we are being given special access to secret conversations and information. It's ingenious how Everett uses this same dynamic several times throughout his novel, but to very different effect. There's one moment where James is in his former home and he witnesses an enslaved woman being raped, and rather than the voyeuristic charge found in Twain's novel, being concealed in this position and being forced to witness this is absolutely horrifying, and it drives home the real practice, consequences, and meaning of slavery during this time. Of course, Twain could have never openly written about such a scene, but in thinking about the worlds that he evoked, realistically, Tom and Huck would have witnessed many such acts of violence towards slaves, but that James has this experiences and sees this horrifying scene, and thinking about his burning desire to find and free his family, it's very satisfying that he goes on this path of revenge, even though he is a very thoughtful and reserved and caring person. But I was thinking about this section of the interview that Everett gave with Nelson, where he recounted this very harrowing experience from his own childhood. So I want to show you when he related this story, because I think it really informed the way he wrote this novel.
Tell you a quick story. Make this too long. My father and I were driving back from my mother's family home in South Carolina, and I must have been 9. And off in a field, we saw a burning cross, and now that's the action of what's called the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist group that's sprung up in the South of the United States in the 19th century after the Civil War, and persisted well into the 20th, and does exist now in very sad, pathetic little groups. But no less dangerous. At 9, we saw the burning cross. Cars were slowing down. And there was a checkpoint. Cars were coming up, and ridiculous-looking white men with tall white hats were standing there looking into cars. And then they were passing on. And I was 9, and of course it was terrifying, but I didn't know the history of this. I didn't know exactly what was going on. My father, the gentlest person I have ever known, the nicest man I had ever known, suddenly in his lap, from someplace I did not see, he produced something I did not know was ever in the car, a pistol. He remained quiet, and when we came to the checkpoint, he stepped on the accelerator and we sped away. And luckily in our lives, we were not chased by any of these people. And then the pistol was gone. That was my lesson, is that my quiet, gentle father knew that there had to be a time, could be a time in his life when he was not going to be quiet and gentle. Because his child was like, and that's, I'll leave it at that.
So like his father, James is a naturally calm and peaceful individual whose anger rouses him to justified violence, and it's really moving following that throughout this story and how Everett handles his character throughout it, and also how he brings into the book a Twain sense of adventure, but he also challenges the reader to think about race and language and literature and history in a much more complex way. It was especially striking to me that when news of the coming American Civil War reaches James, he understands that it has little to do with him. And I think this makes us consider the way we view this period of history and how it's often thought of as this moral or virtuous battle to end slavery. But actually, the reality of it had so much more to do with economics and politics and conserving the Union, but that the meaning of it was very different to a lot of the individuals that were caught up in this strife. And we know that this didn't end racial divisions in America. And we can see that in viewing history and the civil rights movement and through the news that we see on TV today. So I found following James's journey completely engrossing, and I came to really care about him as a character and the multi-layered connection he forms with Huck over the course of the story. But I'd really be keen to hear about what you think about this novel. If you've read it, have you also read or reread Huck Finn before getting to this novel? And what do you think about the connections between the two books and the different ways the authors approached these stories? I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. But also, if you feel like there were any elements of this novel that possibly could have been done better. I mean, there's very little that I would change about this book, although I do wish that over the course of their journey, there had been like more memories or recollections that James had towards his family so that we could understand their relationship better. I mean, I know he wasn't with them throughout a lot of this story, but I think if we had got that, we would have understood the complexity of his connection with his family better. But that's really nitpicking in a story that I thought was otherwise absolutely excellent, a brilliant new way of viewing the same story that's been told and loved for a long period of time, and a really necessary addition to the canon of American literature. So absolutely brilliant. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you think about it in the comments below. But thank you for watching me discuss this novel. I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.